I think is an absolutely wonderful example of open access journal publishing, in that everything in that journal is totally freely available to everyone. And it's also a wonderful example of the format Stephen has pioneered, the target article and commentary format, where people set out a provocative view and then loads of people send in their commentaries. And from the beginning in 2016, this journal has been publishing incredibly vigorous debate around topics of animal sentience, starting out with a very influential one about whether fish feel pain or not. I think in the end, giving a very strong case that they do, even though the target article had been arguing that they don't. And see if I can need to activate the clicker. There we go. I think 8 years later, a new field is genuinely emerging, an emerging interdisciplinary field of animal sentience research. If you look at the journal, you see the number of different disciplines people are coming to this topic from. It's not just the sciences, and it's not just the arts and humanities either. You've got people from my own discipline, philosophy, but also people from animal welfare and veterinary science, people from neuroscience, people from comparative psychology, people from evolutionary biology, people from the behavioral sciences, and people from law as well, and the social sciences, thinking about the ways in which new evidence about animal sentience should change the law and the way we treat animals. But unsurprisingly, a field that is being coalesced from so many different disciplines faces foundational challenges, debates about what sentience is, debates about how we can study it scientifically. That's what my project has been trying to make some progress on. It's been a real pleasure to build up a team, including Andrew, who we'll hear about shortly. I mean, Andrew is just on the edge of technically leaving the team to go full-time at the Royal Veterinary College, tragically. My postdocs are too successful for their own good. Tragically, they end up leaving the project and moving on into permanent lectureships. So Heather moved to Southampton, and now Andrew is moving to the RVC. But the team has quite a big group now. And our goals are to develop better methods for studying the conscious experiences of other animals scientifically, and new ways of using the science to design better policies, laws, and ways of caring for animals. If you want to bring up these slides, there's a link there on bit.ly/BirchQMUL that might be particularly useful for people online. And if you go to the slides, you can click on any of these links. We've been doing work in a number of different areas. Some of it is very conceptual in character. We're trying to construct conceptual frameworks for thinking about how the subjective experiences of other animals might vary. In this paper in Trends in Cognitive Sciences, we argued against the idea that there is some kind of single sliding scale on which we can rank animals and say that some of them are more conscious than others, that a mammal is more conscious than a crow, or that a crow is more conscious than an octopus. We don't think these sorts of comparisons make sense. But what does make sense is the idea of constructing multi-dimensional profiles where we recognize many different dimensions of variation. Other animals live in very different sensory worlds from us. They have very different emotional lives. Their experiences might display all kinds of differences in the way they integrate at a time or across time. You think of the octopus, for example, and how many ganglia it has around the arms. You're potentially looking at a system in which conscious experience is much less unified than it is in mammals. And so we proposed a framework for thinking about some of the dimensions of variation that we think are likely to really matter. There's also a side to the project that is empirical, and Andrew will be talking about this in his introductory comments, but it is about trying to get new evidence that can shift the dial about sentience in cases where it's genuinely disputed. One of the really big debates in recent years has been about insects. And so part of the project has been doing work here at Queen Mary in the bee lab to get new evidence. I'll let Andrew speak about that later. And there's also a strong ethical side to the project as well, where we're asking, well, all of this new evidence that has been emerging over the past 10 years and that is potentially pushing us to expand our moral circle, to take seriously the possibility of feelings of pleasure and pain in animals where perhaps in the past we didn't take it seriously. Animals like octopuses, squid, cuttlefish, crabs, lobsters, shrimps, insects. What are our ethical obligations in relation to these animals? Once we take seriously a realistic possibility that they're sentient, that they're having subjective experiences with a positive or negative character. And I've written various things on different aspects of this topic, including a recent review of Peter Singer's book, Animal Liberation Now, in the journal Nature. And there's also the policy-facing side as well, which I know the organizers of this series are very strongly interested in, because we've been taking the new evidence to policymakers to try and make animal welfare laws better informed and more inclusive of invertebrate animals in cases where we think the evidence warrants it. In 2021, a team led by me was commissioned by DEFRA to produce a review of the evidence of sentience in cephalopod mollusks and decapod crustaceans. So this is particularly octopuses, squid, cuttlefish, crabs, lobsters, crayfish, shrimp. We reviewed over 300 scientific studies as part of that project. We constructed a framework for organizing and synthesizing the evidence. And we made a recommendation that it would be appropriate to protect these animals in UK animal welfare laws going forward. And the government pleasingly did act on our central recommendation. They had this draft of a bill called the Animal Welfare Sentience Bill that only included vertebrates. This understandably led to some pushback from animal welfare organizations like the RSPCA and Universities Federation for Animal Welfare. We're saying the science has moved on. There should be some invertebrates protected by this law as well. That was why the review was commissioned. And then the government took seriously our recommendation that they should indeed amend the legislation. And so the Animal Welfare Sentience Act of 2022, as it now is, does extend to cephalopod mollusks and decapod crustaceans. What it does is create a duty on policymakers to pay all due regard for these animals as sentient beings, and in effect to consider the animal welfare impact of their decisions. There's also a committee that's been created called the Animal Sentience Committee that is meant to monitor compliance with that duty. I think it's very much an open question how effectively that committee will do its job. But we'll be finding out over the next few years. And in addition to all of this, the conceptual side, the empirical side, the ethics side, the policy-facing side, I see a further aim of the project as one of field building. As I said at the beginning, we're trying to build a very broad coalition of people from many different disciplines, reaching right across the sciences, the arts, and the humanities. And there's a lot of field building work to be done. And with some of these massively co-authored editorials, like this one in the Journal of Consciousness Studies from 2022, and one more recently in Current Biology, we've been just getting big groups of people together and saying, well, give us your perspective on this issue. And we pose them a question like, how should we study animal consciousness scientifically? And say, answer that question in 500 words or fewer. And these pieces are quite fun to read because you see how much variation there still is in people's perspectives on these questions. So we have a lot going on in many different areas, and I'm now going to hand over to Andrew, who's going to introduce his particular empirical side of the project. Thanks very much. We'll just set up Andrew's slides. And Andrew, you want to take the mic?
I'm entirely sure this is going to go.
It is a good mic. Very good value.
I'd like to introduce Mike.
Okay, there's your slides, Andrew.
Thanks. Have you got the wee clicker?
And the clicker is here. Yeah. Perfect. Use needs to be somehow selected. I think it might be running out. Oh no, I turned it off.
There we go.
I instinctively just turned the clicker off.
Perfect.
But in this case, over to you, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, and thank you to the organisers for inviting me here to speak today. So Jonathan is a philosopher. Unlike Jonathan, I'm a scientist. Please don't hold that against me. I think that we'll probably be talking today a bit about the kind of evidence for sentience. And so before we started the kind of panel discussion, I just wanted to introduce a study which I worked on, but I certainly didn't lead it, which kind of introduces potentially evidence for sentience. What kind of evidence are we talking about in an animal like a bee? So this is a study on motivational trade-offs in bumblebees and how that might be perceived as evidence for pain. So I guess just to start off, as a scientist, my interest in sentience is whether an animal like a bee can feel something like pain. And often when people hear this is what I do, they think it's a very obvious answer. They say, well, hang on a second, animals withdraw from injury, therefore they must feel pain. And they look at me like I'm an idiot. But here I think we need to draw an important distinction, which is between what's known as nociception and pain. And I think that if an animal withdraws from injury, that doesn't necessarily mean the animal experiences pain because of this distinction. So what do these terms mean? Well, nociception is the processing of noxious stimuli. It's the way that humans and other animals process noxious stimuli, so stimuli that might cause tissue damage. Pain is the unpleasant feeling which in humans goes along with that nociception. But the two are kind of semi-distinct. So nociceptive reflexes do not require pain. And we can illustrate that in the human case with this lovely diagram here. So this is a person and their sort of very simplified nervous system. This person is touching a needle for reasons of scientific discovery, I guess. And we can see sort of two things that happen here. The first thing that happens in the nervous system is that you get a kind of signal from where the needle is touched, goes up the arm to the spinal cord here around number 4 and 5. And then from the spinal cord, you get this kind of nerve back to the bicep. And that causes the person to pull their arm away. So that kind of classic withdrawal response to touching a needle, that's caused by this, what we call a nociceptive reflex arc. So that's the kind of nociceptive aspect of this. Then we also get a sort of second semi-independent aspect of this response, which happens up here. So the signal is also transmitted from the spinal cord, not down to the bicep. I'm going to try and avoid shining this into Jonathan's eye, up to the brain. And the brain is where pain is felt. If we touch a needle, we feel the pain in our finger, but the pain essentially is generated in the brain. And so what this means is that if I touch a needle and I pull my arm away, I don't actually have to feel pain to do that. That can just be a simple nociceptive reflex. And so if an animal withdraws from injury, this is me just angrily getting back at all the people who've said animals withdraw from injury. If an animal withdraws from injury, that does not necessarily tell us that they feel pain. So then the kind of bigger question is, well, how might we tell whether an animal feels pain? How might we distinguish between these kind of simple nociceptive reflexes and a response that actually involves pain, the thing that we're interested in? And one way of doing that is to look at these things called motivational trade-offs. So to ask the question, will the animal trade off the motivation to avoid a noxious stimulus, something like touching a needle, against a competing motivation? Why is this interesting? Why is this kind of trade-off interesting? Well, I think there are kind of three main reasons. Reason number one is that if an animal does these kind of motivational trade-offs, the response cannot be just a simple reflex. When I touch a pin and I pull my arm away, that sort of pulling my arm away is almost automatic. It happens reflexively. There isn't this kind of trade-off of decision-making. So it's not a simple reflex. That's point number one. Point number two is that it involves centralized decision-making. And remember, pain arises in the brain. So if I know the decision is happening up in the brain, I know the decision is not just modulated by the spinal cord, it's happening up where pain happens. So there's kind of this element in which the location is right for pain. And then thirdly, the response is modulated by context. So the context in which this happens modulates the response. And that's a hallmark of pain in humans. So if you think about, say, people in contact sports, in rugby, for example, they can sustain really severe injuries. But if you ask the players afterwards, they'll say, actually, I didn't really feel any pain in the moment because I was focusing so much on the game. So this kind of modulation of response by context is a real hallmark of pain. So what this means is that motivational trade-offs, they don't prove that an animal feels pain. I guess that'll probably be one of the themes of today. They don't tell us conclusively. But I think at the very least, they mean that pain cannot be easily ruled out. They mean that we have to take this seriously. And historically, for an animal like a bumblebee, researchers who studied these have said, well, it's ridiculous that they feel pain. We can absolutely rule that out. They purely respond by reflexes. But if they're responding by these kind of motivational trade-offs, I think we can't do that simple ruling out of pain. So Jonathan mentioned our report for the government. That included kind of 8 criteria, 8 different lines of evidence for whether, which sort of, the more evidence you have, the more likely it is that an animal can feel pain. And one of those 5 lines of evidence is animals showing these kind of motivational trade-offs. The balancing of threat against opportunity for reward. And this is precisely why. So, okay, let's come back now to bumblebees. So in our study, and it was led by Matilda Gibbons, you can see here in Lars Chitka's lab here at Queen Mary. So this is a nice local interest story. Matilda did this during her PhD. We asked, well, can bumblebees perform these motivational trade-offs? Do we have this line of evidence for pain in bumblebees? And the two motivations that we were looking at, firstly, the sort of noxious motivation was to avoid 50-degree heat. So if bees walk on a kind of heat plate, which is at 50 degrees, they really don't like it. They try and avoid that sort of heat. So that's this noxious stimulus. And then we're looking at, do they trade that motivation off against their really strong motivation to consume high concentration sugar water? So bees, kind of like little kids, they absolutely love sugar. And the higher the concentration of sugar in water, the crazier they go for it. And so we're looking at, do they trade off that avoidance of 50-degree heat against that motivation to get high concentration sugar water? Here's our setup. So this is the setup here. This is the nest box for the bees. So the queen would be in this black box at the bottom here. And we have a nice iPhone recording it, very high tech in the bee lab. And then this is the arena here. And you can see that in the arena, you have these sort of 4 different colored feeders. So you have 2 pink feeders, and there's a sort of close-up of a pink feeder here with a nice little CGI bee on it. And then 2 yellow feeders. So the bees basically have a choice of which feeder to go to. Now the yellow feeders, so these 2 here, they dispense 40% sugar solution. So for bees, this is like crazy good. This is like great day for a bee. But the bees have to walk on heat pads in order to get there. So underneath these feeders, they have this sort of 50-degree heat. So sure, they get this really high concentration sugar solution, but in order to do it, they might have to endure 50-degree heat. However, at the other feeders, so the pink feeders, it depends on the bee, but they have often lower concentrations of sugar solution, so 10, 20, or 30%, but they also have no heat. So the bees, sure, they can avoid the heat, but they have to settle often for sort of lower concentrations of sugar solution. I've got a nice little, this isn't really very relevant, but I've got a cute video here of a bee actually using one of our feeders. There we go. You can see, people always ask me, how do we ID our bees? You can see the nice little number on the back there. This is number 58. So you can see this bee is standing on the heat pad and drinking from the feeder here. Again, very high tech in the bee lab. These are the results. I'm not going to go too deep into this, but up along the bottom here, we have the sugar concentration at those pink feeders. So the ones that aren't heated. So there's 10%, 20%, 30%, and 40%. Then up the side here, we have the proportion of feeds at the yellow feeders, which may or may not be heated. So here you have like kind of 100% down to 0%. And broadly speaking, what you can see is this kind of general line where as the sugar concentration at those alternative feeders goes up, the proportion of feeds at the yellow feeders goes down. That's what we'd expect, right? If you have higher concentration sugar at the other feeders, you're less inclined to go to those yellow ones. But the really cool thing here is that if we turn on those heat pads, so if we introduce that motivational trade-off, what we find is that actually that effect is more pronounced. So the bees are trading off this kind of avoidance of heat against their preference for high concentrations of sugar solution. They're more inclined to go for those heated feeders if they have a bigger difference in the sugar solution concentration. So I guess what we can answer from this is that yes, bees do trade off heat avoidance against that motivation for high concentration sugar solution. This is, I think, pretty good evidence for motivational trade-offs in bees. Oh, that's the wrong way. And that this response is at least consistent with the capacity for pain. I think we can't rule out pain in bees easily. This sort of historic statement by insect researchers that clearly these animals don't feel pain, clearly they're responding by reflexes. That's simply not true. I'm not saying this is proof for pain in bees, but I think it's at least the start of a line of evidence that potentially they might experience pain. And I guess we'll discuss more what the kind of implications of that are in the discussion. But just to finish off and say thank you all for listening and very much looking forward to your questions.
Well, I mean, I don't have to ask anything if people already have questions. But if not, oh, okay, there we go.
Well, as you said, very good value. So yes, because one of the things you said one of the things I was thinking when you said motivational trade-off is I was thinking, well, there's a cognitive, presumably you're imparting some kind of cognitive element to this process. And then I said to myself, is it sufficient simply to show that negative stimuli modulate behavior somehow? That seems the answer is no, right? It seems the answer can't be that can't be the same thing. So I would say, well, how do you establish that a cognitive process is going on rather than just some kind of essentially maybe broadly reflective but still modulated? There's a difference between a kind of reactive reflective process which is modulated by other things versus a cognitive process. Now we're thinking, well, you would probably want to have different kind of modalities, different kind of interventions on the bees, and show a much broader spectrum of behavior which is sensitive to lots of different things. Because I mean, it's implausible to suppose that a bee has, you know, a million different scenarios in its head that it's reacting to, for example. Now, I didn't have long enough to interpret that graph, but I was wondering if the spread of behavior as demonstrated by that graph, in your view, does actually show a spread, essentially a spread of the kind of spread you'd expect if the bees are genuinely cognitively reacting, or whether you think actually it's consistent with a fairly narrow modulated kind of reflex. In other words, one would expect even a very programmed naive robot like a Rumba or something, that if you put an obstacle in its way, would make some kind of trade-off against so-called noxious stimuli, right?
Yeah, can I just clarify before I answer? When you say cognitive, you're referring to the animal having sort of mental representation. Is that what you mean? Or
no, well, I guess I don't want to monopolize the conversation too much, but what I mean to say is that I take your argument is this, that look, at least as far as we can tell, animals that we know feel pain. The reason we think they feel pain is because, one, we have subjective evidence, and two, because there is a co-location of these systems in their head, and pain has a kind of at least a prima facie plausible causal role in the various locations in where this is happening. I think, first of all, that seems extraordinary to impart that model onto a bee, because such co-locations don't seem to translate so obviously. And so when I interpret your claim about bee behavior and bee pain, my interpretation is that you're saying something like that there is some kind of similar system in a bee which does some kind of similar work as it would do in a system in an animal which feels pain, that is located near some kind of mechanism for behavioral modulation. And therefore, if we show significant behavioral modulation, that would so it's a very tenuous, multi-step, quite fragile argument, right? But I'm at least willing to go along with it. But my point is that even if I grant all your premises, my question at the very end is, are we actually even seeing that? Because it would be implausible to say that no modulation of behavior. The alternative would be, unless we see deterministic behavior in bees, then we know there's no motivation. This just seems an implausible kind of counter. Do you see what I'm trying to say there?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, absolutely. And I think if this were the kind of 30-minute version of this talk rather than the sort of 5 to 10-minute version of this talk, probably would have got a bit deeper into that. So I think essentially the argument is more against what has historically been given as reasons that insects definitely don't feel pain. And there's not that many papers on this before sort of 15 or so years ago. But the papers that were around then were basically saying, well, look, these animals are essentially just responding very simply, the very simple stimulus response. There wasn't actually this idea that they could modulate responses at all, which we now know is categorically not true. And we know it's categorically not true, not just from this kind of work, but also from lots of stuff on Drosophila and so on as well. Now, that's not to say, and I hope I took sort of some pains to emphasize this, that this demonstrates pain in bees. I don't think it does. I think it's sort of one line of evidence against that idea that we can easily rule it out. But basically precisely the reasons that you're talking about. So we know that in C. elegans, for example, they can perform a trade-off, which actually isn't as complex as this, but essentially, exactly like you're saying, they can kind of modulate their responses based on competing motivations, and that's made possible by a very simple neural mechanism. So we do know to some extent that, yes, that's possible. I mean, one of the good things I think about this study is that it was based on associative learning rather than very simple responses. But again, I totally take your point. What I think this shows is that the kind of traditional arguments where we can say for sure they don't feel pain, for sure they're only responding by very simple reflexes, those clearly are not true. And that's why I think one of the themes which we might get to and which Jonathan is much better qualified to talk about is there is no smoking gun for whether an animal feels pain. There is no study which can kind of demonstrate that conclusively.
Oh, well, that's obviously true. Yeah, but I think it's worth emphasizing the point you made very quickly there about the role of learning in producing these behaviors, that we're not looking for a trade-off between two immediately present stimuli, which is what it looks a bit like in the video is what's going on. But what we were looking for was the ability to, in prospect, weigh up the risks and threats presented by the feeders. So they they learn they learn the risks and opportunities afforded by the environment, and then even if you took those punishers and rewards away, so if you replace the sugar solution with water and turn the heat pads off, they would still, they'd go for the ones that they'd associated with a certain level of reward. So I mean, in the paper, it's put in terms of memory dependence. They're memory dependent trade-offs, that they've learned something about the landscape, the sort of reward and punishment landscape of this environment, and they're making the trade-offs using that representation rather than using the immediate stimuli. So that's certainly a step beyond what one sees in C. elegans or in Rumba, I would say. And then, of course, as Andrew also emphasized, it doesn't conclusively establish that they're feeling pain. But it's part of an emerging picture, along with many other lines of evidence, that we think should lead to a realistic possibility of there being subjective experience there in a way that people casually dismissed in the past.
Question from you? Actually, yeah, right. Thank you so much. Is it connected? Yeah. So my question is to Jonathan. Thank you so much to both for your presentations. But in law, we used to see that usually the model of consciousness, it's the model of consciousness that is in some way extended to animals or to non-humans, is in a way modeling the human being. So it's I'm very happy to hear that you are trying to develop some sort of variation or model of variation of consciousness that is not in a way hierarchical and that not pose on the top the human being and then a kind of gradation of consciousness that goes to the bottom, in which you have some sort of non-human, an insect or whatever. So I was wondering if you can develop this a little bit more, if you can say a little bit more about these different variations and what are these different dimensions that you are taking into account to speak about these variations of consciousness.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I sort of see it as like the second classic mistake, I suppose, in the history of philosophy. If the first one, when thinking about animals, is to deny that they have any subjective experience at all, I think is a huge mistake. The second mistake is to grant that they do, but then have some kind of chain of being model in mind, where there's clear ranks and there's higher and lower animals, and we need to get away from that too, towards a model where we're thinking of, well, the sentient world as being very broad, probably including some invertebrates, not just vertebrates, and every animal, every species in that world having its own sentience profile or consciousness profile, a particular way of experiencing the world that will be unlike any other in some ways. In sensory aspects, probably quite different. You think of bats and the capacity to echolocate, the famous paper on this called "What is it like to be a bat?" The experienced sensory world of a bat, even though they're still mammals, being very, very different from our own. And crucially, I think it's not just that the sensory worlds vary, but also the affective capacities as well, the sort of emotional capacities, and more structural elements of experience too. And that's what I was alluding to with the discussion of the octopus and the fact that there's so many nerve centers in the arms and in the ring of nervous tissue connecting the arms. And it seems like some important control functions are dedicated to that nerve ring, and that sort of delegated by the brain. And it's pushing us to think about, are there forms of conscious experience that are substantially less unified than the human form? And that's fascinating. And to a large extent, we don't know the answers to these questions. So to a large extent, we don't know when thinking about octopuses, how much of the relevant basis of experience is in the central brain versus the nerve ring around the arms. These are huge unknowns, but these are the right questions to be asking, I think. And that they should be part of the agenda when we're developing this emerging science of animal consciousness. How can we develop new methods for gaining traction on those kinds of questions? Questions that take us beyond both the is it conscious at all question and the where does it rank question, which we do need to move beyond, I think.
Why don't we take a couple of questions from online?
Questions in the chat.
Yes, questions in the chat. Yes. So I'll just read out one by Melina, which is, I understand how pain or nociceptive reflex versus motivation to avoid in favor of a competing motivation helps us refine understanding of sentience, but perception, noxious stimuli, whether automatic or otherwise, surely indicate also perception of potential harm. Yes. This is one question. Second question to Jonathan. If definition of consciousness may be more capacious, then our understanding of consent must develop in ways beyond assent-dissent, which is the distinction that the Haley and paper have made in a 2021 paper. Have you thoughts? What are your thoughts about forms of consent? So you can take either or neither of these questions.
Well, Andrew, maybe you want to do the first one about perception.
Yes, I can. Yes. Yeah. So on the first one, absolutely, it indicates an ability to perceive potential harms. That's absolutely true. I think the question then becomes, well, is that conscious perception of potential harms? And in humans, we know that perception is not necessarily conscious. So subliminal perception is a very well-studied area. So, for example, if you're watching an advert on TV, then the kind of subliminal advertising thing might be to like flash up an image of a Coke can, and you haven't seen it consciously. You wouldn't say that I've seen a Coke can, but nonetheless, you might then want to buy or drink a Coke afterwards. So we can kind of distinguish between conscious versus unconscious perception. So in the B case, sure, it definitely demonstrates that they can perceive harms, but the question then becomes, well, is that conscious perception or not? Which is a question I'm very interested in.
Not a very difficult one.
Yeah.
Yeah. This seems.
Sorry, Jonathan, can I ask you, as I think is a pre-question to this one, whether there's a distinction between sentience and consciousness, and whether you can just briefly give us a definition of each if they are not the same?
Yeah, I think they're not the same, and helpfully they are both used in many different ways. It's part of there being such a broad coalition of disciplines working on these topics that people coming to the topic from a particular disciplinary perspective may define concepts in a way that is very unfamiliar to people in other disciplines. I think to some extent one just has to try to manage that. But I think when we're talking about consciousness, some people have something very sophisticated in mind, which can be reflection and self-awareness, self-consciousness. And I think these can be distinguished from a base level, the most basic kind of consciousness, which is just having any conscious experience at all, there being anything it's like, anything it feels like to be you. And so when we're talking about sentience, we're trying to draw people's attention to that most elemental, most evolutionarily ancient base level of consciousness. And then also at the same time, we're often also trying to draw people's attention to the positive or negative quality that some of our experiences often have, particularly experiences of pleasure and pain. I don't think all experiences are necessarily like that. Maybe some are completely neutral. But obviously pain feels very bad and pleasure feels good. And so usually when I'm defining sentience, I'm usually saying, well, I'm talking about conscious experiences in that basic sense that have a positive or a negative quality, such as experiences of pain and pleasure. I think that's the best I can do for a definition that can unite what all of the people from all of these different disciplines have in common as a shared interest. Does that help?
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of the question here.
Just to repeat the question, how does this idea of consciousness or sentience relate to ideas of consent or assent, dissent?
I
if
like
at all?
the mention of Richard Healy and Angie Pepper's work. Richard Healy is at the LSE at the moment as a postdoc, so he's a colleague. And as I said in my introduction, it's very important to me that this project has an ethical dimension and that we engage with animal ethics, in which Richard works. Now, certainly in animal ethics, there are some very radical views out there, including ones on which notions that people often think are uniquely human, even once they've accepted that sentience is not, like the idea of consent, for example, might have a much broader application. So, for example, there might be something distinctively wrong about animal experimentation because we don't have the consent of the subject. And I think that is a reasonable view that belongs in the debate. It's obviously, obviously the experimental work we're doing does not have the consent of the bees. So when we're following scientific norms here in not really seeking consent. What we do try to do is minimize the harm caused. I think it's fair to say. Andrew, perhaps you want to comment on that, because in actually doing this work, you must be reflecting constantly on, to what extent can it be justifiable to risk causing harm to the animals with a view to trying to get people to take them more seriously as welfare subjects?
Yeah, big question. I guess there's kind of two parts to the answer. Part number one is that, at least in the work that I do, I try and make it as non-invasive or minimally invasive as possible. So you might notice that sort of the whole point of the experiment presented there was that bees have the choice of where they want to feed. They can choose to go onto the feeders if the reward is high enough, but they can equally choose to avoid it. So most of my research is along those lines, where to some extent, I guess, I'm not a philosopher, but that is some level of consent on the part of the bees, that they can choose whether or not to endure that sort of noxious experience.
It isn't. My own view is that the concept of consent is not applicable in these cases, rather than that they do consent. But I see what you mean, that they are choosing to participate in the experimental apparatus we put in front of them.
Yeah, so I guess, sorry, yes.
I'll have to give you a microphone. But did you want to finish your...
Yeah, just very briefly,
Yeah.
sorry. Part number two is that our experiments typically involve sort of fewer than 100 individual bees. I'm not saying that their suffering doesn't matter, but if you think of the kind of industries that we're talking about influencing, say insect farming, you're talking about 1 trillion plus individual insects every year. Like 100 bees, I'm not saying those 100 bees aren't important. If we're talking about 1 trillion, which is a 1 and 15 zeros, then the number of individuals that might benefit from this versus the ones that unfortunately we do have to harm in these situations, it's just a massively skewed calculation. And in fact, even organizations like PETA, who are this sort of very hardline animal rights organization, who say that no animal experimentation, even for welfare benefits, should be allowed, even they are inviting people who do this kind of research along and trumpeting their work, because they do see this massive potential benefit.
I'm sure at some level they don't endorse it, but they do use the results. Yeah, but I think that's worth emphasizing, that a key motivation for you in doing the work is to try and construct some kind of welfare guidelines for the insect farming industry. That you have this enormous new farming industry that is growing at a very rapid pace, it would seem, and with absolutely no welfare guidelines at all. So there's not even any guidance really on how to slaughter these insects in insect farms, and they're often killed in rather questionable ways. And so, yes, it seems like a very good motive to want to change that. How can we construct the evidence base that could actually allow some proper welfare regulation of this emerging industry?
So, you're a philosopher, so you know that in Plato's laws, there is this stranger, the Athenian stranger, who wanders in from elsewhere and asks lots of disruptive questions, which are irrelevant. So please feel free to dismiss the questions that I'm about to ask. I wanted to ask about, and I'm here on behalf of a student who studies animal sentience. So I wanted to ask 3 questions. One to do with, they're just comments really. One to do with your very broad swathe of concerns where you had Martha Nussbaum, for example, talking about the capabilities approach and animal justice. Now, the capabilities approach applied to humans includes, things like senses, imagination, thought, bodily integrity, etc., environment and so on. These do not translate so easily into any kind of studies of sentience. I would like to know what is the how you can build a bridge between these very large abstract concepts and questions of sentience. The second question has to do with some experiments which a friend of mine did on phantom limbs and animals. Do animals have phantom limbs? That is to say, in a human being, if you cut off a leg or an arm, you still feel pain and you exhibit pain behaviors in that limb which has been lost. So similarly, if you cut the wings off, so I know you're not allowed to do this, but as a thought experiment, if you did it, would you find that animals had phantom limbs that you could test on? The third question has to do with Darwin. We've done studies on the expression.
Start like answering, and then we'll go back for more questions.
Okay, sure. So I won't ask about Darwin. We're doing studies on it, but
we can go back to Darwin. Yes, I mean, on the phantom limb thing, I'm not aware of any evidence looking at that in animals. You, Andrew? Just not to say there isn't any, but I'm not aware of any. And then the Nussbaum question, that's great. Yes, I'm very interested in the capabilities approach. With my PhD student Eva Reed, we wrote a long essay review of Nussbaum's recent book, Justice for Animals. I think it's fair to say there's a lot of unfinished business in that framework. And perhaps one hoped for things from the book that weren't actually delivered. I think it's very implausible to me that there could be a single list of capabilities that captures what flourishing is for the entire sentient world. I think you're going to need quite different lists for different animals. And we're really at the start of that project, because we don't understand what the list should be like for an octopus, for example. And we don't really know what kinds of research are going to be needed to populate that list and tell us what the central capabilities are. So I see it as a really exciting idea for a future research program that we're still at very, very early stages of. The role of sentience in all this for Nussbaum is that it sort of gives you entry to the club, as it were. It gives you the kind of significant striving, as she calls it, that means you have claims to justice. It means you have an entitlement to have your central capabilities secured. And so it plays a very important role as just gaining entry. And so I think Nussbaum should recognize that insects probably gain entry to the club here. And within her framework, they have entitlements. And then, the questions about how we identify what the capabilities are and what the entitlements are is business for the future. It's really, really open, I think, at the moment. So the Darwin question.
The Darwin question has to do, sorry. So Darwin wrote The Expression of Emotions in Man and the Animals, which we are doing work on, repeating his questionnaire, which he sent to 30 countries, and he had 16 emotions, like how is surprise expressed and how is something. Now, he doesn't pay that much attention to sentience. He pays attention to expressions of the emotion, that is, performances of the emotions. And again, and he didn't know anything about neurology and the brain and so on and so on. So with I won't mention our studies, but I just want to understand if you have things like aggression, which Darwin talks about in swans and dogs and human beings and so on, across cultures and across societies. These are not at all evidence of any kind of sentience. Is it possible to ever establish with human beings, or except asking a direct question, do you feel pain, that people feel pain? Because Darwin studies and many other studies don't really answer this question
It's going to
about
depend what you mean by
sentience.
establish, you know?
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
With other humans, I'm certainly quite happy to talk of knowledge, you know, that I think we really know that other people feel things, including pain, on the basis of an inference to the best explanation from their behavior, including the linguistic behavior and the non-verbal behavior. And I think that that kind of inference to the best explanation, where you have a wide range of different sources of data, and you're saying, well, what would explain this data? This can be a source of knowledge, even though the argument is not a deductive one. And I think that broadly the same logic applies to other animals as well, that we don't have the linguistic evidence, which is a real shame, because we don't have some of the strongest lines of evidence from humans we don't have for other animals. But what we do have is really quite significant, because the ranges of different behaviors we can look at really do a lot to raise the probability of sentience quite a lot, I think. And this argument is very widely accepted for mammals. There's not really many people who will seriously argue that their pet dogs or cats feel nothing. And similarly, when it comes to sort of lab rats and mice, the sciences have recognized these as appropriate targets of welfare protection for a very long time. I think we just need to, so not set an impossibly high bar here, set a realistic bar where we're not requiring language. But then once we've set that bar, apply it consistently. And a sort of evidential bar for making an inference to the best explanation. And if we're finding that mammals meet the standards, then we should apply those standards consistently and allow invertebrates a chance at meeting them as well, and not dismiss the idea of sentience in invertebrates just because they're very different from us and separated from us by over 500 million years of evolution. These are not good enough reasons.
Okay, let's take some more questions from people who haven't spoken before.
Thank you. Fascinating talk. That flow from science through to philosophy, through to policy is deeply important and powerful. And the imperative you talked about with insect farming, for example, coming through, just broadening the scope of beings that we include in our current regimes of philosophy and policy is deeply important, because they have no protection at the moment. But at the same time, those current regimes of protection we have for beings that are widely regarded and deeply understood as sentient doesn't do much for them, given the prevailing behaviors we have around animal agriculture, for example, which in simple practical terms says that we know you're sentient, but you can be harmed, exploited, and killed for trivial reasons. So the practical question, I guess, in those latter stages of your project is, how can we avoid that trap whereby we recognize sentience much more broadly and probably much more accurately, but actually philosophical and policy regimes we bring those beings into is still deeply awful and doesn't even get to a level of sort of non-maleficence as an obligation to sentient beings? Sorry for the long question.
No, it's a genuine problem that even in cases where the animal is a mammal, like a pig, and so whether they're sentient or not is not really a source of a great deal of ongoing scientific dispute, because the evidence is as good as we're ever going to get when they can't talk, and the behavioral evidence and the neural evidence is extremely strong. Even then, it doesn't translate into respect for their welfare at the sort of level they deserve. It's obviously a genuine problem, and it's not clear what it takes to shift public attitudes. Actually, it's something we want to do more work on. We have a grant proposal that we recently put in for a chicken sentience initiative, where the idea is to, for that project at least, shift the focus away from the invertebrates to chickens, where the question is not so much are they sentient, because almost everyone agrees that they are. The question is rather one of what would it actually take to shift public attitudes and industry practices to fall better into line with the evidence that already exists. And so what we want to do is have a social science aspect to that project, where we're doing surveys and focus groups, asking questions like, well, what new information about chickens would it take to transform your perceptions of them? Then we go and look for the evidence in question in chickens, see if we find it or not. And then we go back to those people later and see whether the evidence has produced the change in attitude and behavior that they thought it would. And the hope is that, well, if that project is successful, it will be an interesting model. It will provide a lot of relevant data for people who are grappling with these questions of how do you actually bring society and industry practices into line with the evidence of sentience that is already there. Any thoughts on this, Andrew?
Yeah, I guess just specifically on the case of sort of insect versus conventional livestock farming, animal welfare science as a sort of discipline arose from concerns about sort of livestock farming in sort of post-war Britain. And so the systems that we're still not necessarily very happy about today were very much entrenched at the time when animal welfare science was developing. Insect farming, on the other hand, is very much an expanding industry. I think it's much easier to influence an industry as it expands and as new facilities are built, rather than going to an existing industry and saying, well, we have to change this, and that. There's some people who are kind of concerned about insect welfare who think that we can, if you'll forgive the expression, kind of kill insect farming in its crib, but it's still at that point of development. It very much requires kind of investors and so on. I think probably the best way to deal with it is to affect the development of the industry, but still it is a growing industry, and therefore I think there's opportunities to be involved as it grows, rather than something like animal agriculture, which is kind of too big by the time welfare scientists came along, is my feeling.
Just to abuse my position, and then I'll come to the other questions. Following on from the question above, what is the consequence of sentience or consciousness for ethical treatment in your philosophical view? Of course, there are many philosophical frameworks, and you have been contending with several, including utilitarianism by Singer, capabilities approach, maybe a strong animal rights approach by Regan and others, and Francione. Is there commitment in your project to one particular approach or one particular ethical demand that arises, ethical or legal, from sentience?
No, there's certainly a lot of disagreement within the project about animal ethics, just as there is within society generally. You have a very wide spectrum of possible views about how strong our obligations are to sentient beings. I feel as though a point of agreement right across that spectrum is about us having a duty to avoid gratuitous suffering. That if there's something we're doing that is causing suffering, there has to be some good reason we can give for why we're doing that. And then, of course, that leads to disagreement about what counts as a good reason, with some people willing to argue that, you know, what strike me as fairly shallow reasons, like culinary reasons, are good enough reasons. But there, I think what we need to have is debate, and the debate should be as inclusive and high profile as we can make it, and try and get as many people in society talking about these issues as we can. Because I think when you get people in a room and you get them to articulate their reasons and talk about them, people often are quite quick to realize inconsistencies in their own view, and are quite quick to realize that perhaps the reasons they've given for dropping lobsters in pans of boiling water or something like that, when brought out into the light, can actually be seen immediately to be very bad reasons. And so the more discussion, the better in a way. And I'm a believer in the power of discussion to actually generate progress, because there's a lot of low-hanging fruit, one might say, in the animal welfare space, where a lot of practices that happen are just egregiously harmful and can't be justified from any reasonable perspective. And so as soon as you start talking about it and you try and put some pressure on the industry that is doing this thing to justify why it is doing this thing, confidence in it collapses, and change is clearly seen to be needed. And to a large extent, that can proceed without agreement on a specific ethical theory.
Thank you. Let's go to Mario. In descending way, I just
yeah, thank you very much. Maybe two questions which I hope are related. So on one of the graphs, you speak about this multi-dimensional kind of approach, and then you have this, as far as I can see, 5 points. If you could maybe speak to these, because there were like P touch, P something, and then maybe, I mean, there has been also recently, I guess, a push to expand the discussion of sentience also into the plant kingdom. So what are your views on that? If that's a kind of a stretch, or is it, or would it fall on any of these kind of lines of dimensionality?
It is a stretch, yeah, I think so. The Dimensions of Animal Consciousness paper talks about perceptual richness, evaluative richness, unity, temporality, and selfhood. And they're not suggested to be exhaustive of all the variation, but the proposal is that, well, here are 5 important dimensions of variation that we have some grip on how we might be able to study. And so perceptual richness, this is about the sensory worlds of the animal. Evaluative richness is about affect. It's about things feeling good and bad, and how rich their affective world is. Unity is about my example of the octopus and how distributed nervous systems might support less unified forms of consciousness. Temporality is about, is the experience integrated into a stream of consciousness that flows through time in the way that ours does? Or might there be forms of experience with different temporal structures? So, for example, an idea often discussed is that some animals might really live in the moment, without much ability to anticipate what's coming or much ability to remember what's just happened. And there's ways we can investigate whether that is true or not, or whether people are perhaps underestimating other animals when they say that. And selfhood is about abilities to differentiate self from other, which I think can be extremely minimal and bottom out in just very basic mechanisms for discriminating which of the changes in my sensory input are being caused by the world and which are being caused by my own movements. And almost any mobile animal needs to have some mechanisms that will do that, just to help them navigate the world. And then it goes through grades right through to very sophisticated forms of self-awareness that it may well be the case that only humans have. In particular, the ability to recognize ourselves as having minds and of being situated in a world surrounded by lots of other people who also have minds. That's a very demanding thing that lots of other animals may not have. So in all of these cases, there'll be lots of variation, but our claim is that there are ways we can start to gather evidence that illuminates that variation.
Briefly speak about whether it's true that some animals live only in the present, and then we'll go to others.
Well, to a large extent, we don't know. The sorts of evidence that convince us that animals can plan for the future and do remember events from their past has been quite clearly documented in crows and jays by Nikki Clayton's work. And then people sometimes say, well, those abilities are probably not there in fish, for example. So fish probably don't plan for the future or remember events from their past. But this is just it's really just a kind of prejudice. It's the idea that, well, fish look like they're less cognitively sophisticated than birds, so they probably are. And what's needed is rigorous experiments of the type we've had in the crows to actually see whether we can find any evidence of these abilities in fish. So I don't take any view on this one way or the other. I just suspend judgment, really, that these questions of the temporal structure of experience in animals have been so poorly studied outside a small number of mammals and birds that we just don't know, and should just see this as a direction for future research rather than something we already know about. And on plants, yes, there was the question about plants. With plants, my view is simply that the kinds of evidence that have shifted the dial in relation to invertebrate animals like octopuses and crabs and lobsters and insects, they're just not there for plants. The right kinds of evidence have just not been found at all. Now that doesn't mean I think it's an illegitimate topic of inquiry. So people like Paco Calvo, who want to study this topic, as far as I'm concerned, they can study the topic and look for evidence. As long as we're starting from a point of just recognizing that there is no evidence and there's strong grounds for doubt, particularly based on the fact that there's no nervous system, brain in plants. And so my default attitude is one of skepticism, and the plant sentience people, they have a lot of work to do to try and shift the dial from where it is now.
Go to the audience, and then we'll go online.
Thank you for the presentation. I wanted to ask that if establishing that animals are in fact sentient beings, and we draw back it to the trade-offs that we were talking about, then essentially that's basically putting an animal in an environment it's not natural for it, and then there's a reward at the end. So isn't that kind of training that we have like forcing on a particular animal? Wouldn't that actually be opposite to the central argument that they are making a rational choice? Because if we do this a repeated number of times, it forms in this brain that this is the environment, this is how I have to act. So wouldn't that be like detrimental to the central argument that there is a rational trade-off by the insect or an animal?
What do you think, Andrew?
Yeah, good question. Thank you very much. No, I think the opposite. Perhaps unsurprisingly, I think it's based on a particular pattern of results. That if these animals were just always going to the sugar and just walking over extreme heat regardless, then absolutely you'd be dead right. If, however, the animals are deciding whether to walk across that heat, depending on not just the sugar at that particular location, but compared to other locations, but they're making kind of very finely modulated trade-offs. And these trade-offs differ quite a lot between individuals as well, which is another interesting source of variation. That is a rational decision on the part of the animal. I mean, I'm not sure how we would define rational, but certainly they're making kind of quite fine-grained modulated trade-offs. But yeah, really, really good point on experimental design.
Yeah. These experiments we're talking about, they're all about putting animals in situations where they have to make a choice, where they have to make a decision. And they've learned from experience some of the different risks and opportunities associated with the options. And we're looking to see how they make those choices, given what they've learned about the options. So it is, in a way, it's artificial, but it's artificial in a way that is very much trying to avoid just, overtraining them to do the same thing every time, but rather actually getting them to make decisions. Sarah is currently doing an experiment of this type with crickets, where again, it's all about putting them in an arena where they have to make a choice.
A question over here.
I was just going to make so yeah, I'm currently continuing some of the work that they've done on bees, looking at crickets, but my background is actually in fish. So I've worked with fish for the last 8 years. And to answer the question about can they use memories to make future choices, well, at least with the type of fish I work on, weakly electric fish, we know that they can learn things and remember up to a year. So I think that is strong evidence that there is some element of like importance of like an actual like a level of awareness. And they also in these fish are able to use their own body motions to modulate their perception. So again, they have a sense of self-awareness, and they have a particular sensory systems which and neurocircuitry which allows them to cancel out unimportant signals to actually enhance their sensory perception. So at least in those fish species, I think there is some strong evidence for their sentience.
Let's go to some questions online. I'll just read them. I'll just read them out, and then you deal with them as you wish. Why is pain central for discussing sentience? This is a question by Shira. Is it because we are policy oriented? In the B examples, do you agree the evidence is strong enough to show us a creature who has desires and makes subjective calculations, regardless of the question of pain? I guess we can reduce this question to, is pain the only factor of sentience?
Yeah, I mean, I want the field to move beyond its focus on pain, and to be studying a wider range of mental states, and including the positive side of mental life, like joy, pleasure. And we're starting to see studies with those aims. So I think the trajectory will be away from pain and towards a wider range of mental states, and that's absolutely as it should be. At the same time, I can also see why pain has been studied so much more than other kinds of mental states, essentially because it is seen, I think, correctly to have a special kind of ethical significance. It's seen to be something we really do need to watch out for signs of in farming and in animal experimentation. And in fact, a lot of the framework surrounding the licensing for animal experimentation requires researchers to be constantly thinking about the level of pain their procedures are likely to be causing. So I totally understand that traditional focus. It means there's a lot more evidence regarding pain than regarding things like joy, but I would like to see that change over the coming decade.
Another question online is basically asks about anthropomorphizing certain animals. So you may have seen Chicken Run, which is actually a really interesting movie by DreamWorks. I think it's DreamWorks. And the question is
the stop motion one. Aardman.
Sorry?
Yeah, like the Wallace and Gromit ones.
And the question is, what kind of professional welfare or scientific consulting may be in order to avoid this kind of anthropomorphism in this kind of general audience movies? And how has this film, I guess this film in particular, affected the understanding of the chicken industry? As such, approaches worth the risk of inaccuracies or not in educating the general public? I guess this also links to your proposed research, forthcoming research of how does knowledge of sentience, how should it affect the general public, and what would motivate the general public to change behaviors?
I know, I think these are real open questions for the social scientists, primarily. There's obviously a real problem where you have a movie that gets really strong empathetic responses out of people by humanizing the animals. But then they walk out of the theater and think, well, of course, the real animals are not like that. I've just seen a fiction. And that seems to be what happens a lot of the time. When in reality, the animals probably do have mental lives for real, that we can empathize with for real. I think how to cultivate that kind of empathy is a big open question and an important one. I often worry that nature documentaries do not do a great job of this, because sometimes the nature documentaries take a rather lurid interest in violence between animals in a way that is perhaps encouraging us to not empathize, rather than trying to give a rounded picture of their mental lives in ways that allows us to cultivate empathy. some series do that better than others. But I guess we're here in a cinema, I guess, with in the Queen Mary film department. I think there's a huge role there for people in that space, the sort of documentary making space, to think about how they might encourage the cultivation of real empathy that stays with the audience once they leave the theatre.
Sorry to jump in, but a couple of brilliant examples like Cow and Gunda, which it's a couple of recent examples like Cow and Gunda, which explicitly try to achieve that, and as far as you can, use a film, perspective to try and really put us in the position of the non-human animal. It's hard to do, but
yeah, Cow is brilliant. And just to sort of, I guess, add to what Jonathan was saying about Chicken Run specifically, after the first film came out in the early 2000s, for a few weeks there was a fairly appreciable decrease in the consumption of chicken meat in the UK. And then very quickly that went back to normal, which I guess is illustrative of the difficulties of kind of achieving human behavior change. Even if people are coming out the theatres and saying, I really appreciate chickens now, and associating that with their eating habits, very quickly they'll revert back to those original habits. And how do we get around that is sort of not really my area.
Yeah. What is this Cow? I've not seen this.
I guess a Netflix documentary. Yeah.
it follows the dairy. There's no dialogue. Yeah, more of those.
Hear from you.
Thank you. I have about 12 questions I'm trying to synthesize into one. No, I understand. We'll see if I succeed. I find one of the biggest obstacles to empathy, if you like, is in fact language and the conceptual framework that we use to describe human beings. I absolutely loathe it, really. And I find consent is a good example of that. We've imported a legalistic concept into a kind of theory of mind of people, as if people have in their mind, look, as if you go to chapter 12 in the psychology textbook, consent. I mean, this is insane, right? Because of course it's a legal notion which creates boundaries that are relevant for the law, rather than a scientific notion. And I have friends who said, well, we don't think the chickens consent. I was like, well, on earth do you think human beings consent? I mean, in the sense of a psychological phenomenon. So I wondered if there is something we should do in order to reinterpret human beings under the light of this research, and actually go back and peel away from human beings this kind of linguistic, kind of scholastic folly that we have with each other. And I think if you were to do that, I actually would be somewhat skeptical that we are all that different from animals. In other words, I think we are a superset in many cases, that you can point to experiences that people have that have a lower, let's say, more or less complex form of consciousness. And we do have those experiences. And so I actually think that there's a lot more empathy to be drawn by focusing on those ways in which we are like animals in less complex ways, and rhetorically, if you like, doing a nature documentary about people rather and put the mute button on, because my God, right?
Yeah. So there's a philosopher called Cameron Buckner who has coined this term anthropofabulation for what he sees as a kind of opposite of anthropomorphism, where we have this very exalted, very intellectualized view of what goes on in humans when humans do stuff. And we construct these fables, these fables of what is going on in the human mind. And then that leads us to the view that animals couldn't possibly have what we have, because what we have is so exalted. Yeah, so I think there's a lot of truth in this idea that a lot of human behavior a lot of the time is under the control of relatively basic and evolutionarily ancient mechanisms. Things like associative learning have immense importance for us. These basic motivations, bodily sensations, pleasure, pain, thirst, hunger, drive a huge amount of human behavior, and are very probably things we share with a very wide range of other animals. And so simplifying our accounts of our own behavior can be a step towards recognizing the commonality with a wide range of species.
Yeah.
Let's just take another question from Pablo Serra. I think there are two questions. So Pablo says that they agree that we shouldn't rank species based on different levels of sentience, but that there will always be situations of conflicts between sentient creatures, say prey or predators. and perhaps these different gradients of sentience can help us solve some of those moral conflicts? Perhaps that's one question. And the second is, has the Animal Sentience Committee done anything useful so far?
So on the first one, I mean, there's a emerging literature on interspecies welfare comparisons that Heather Browning, who I mentioned earlier, now at Southampton, that was on the project, has been driving conversations on. It's another really, really hard problem. Because if you, predators and prey, if you think of shrimps being fed to cuttlefish in aquariums and things like that, it's one thing to take seriously the sentience of the cuttlefish, but what about the shrimp? Right? And what are our obligations towards the shrimps there in cases where the welfare interests clearly conflict? And there's no agreed answers. The agreement is on there being a huge problem here, and on the need for frameworks that can help us make those comparisons. I think an interesting tantalizing possibility is that the capabilities approach might be of some use in making these comparisons, but it requires much further development than it's so far had in order to deliver on that. In a way, I find that more promising than attempts to try and quantify how intense an animal's pain is, for example, where we don't have a lot of tractability on, does the cuttlefish, how intensely does the cuttlefish feel the pleasure of eating the shrimp versus how intensely does the shrimp feel the pain of getting eaten? We don't have any good grip on those questions right now. The second question, well, the Animal Sentience Committee is very much a work in progress, as I understand it. I'm just about to join another committee, the Animals in Science Committee, which is much older and has a long history of being quite effective in shaping the regulation of animal experimentation laws in the UK. But the role of the Animal Sentience Committee is less clear and is up to its initial membership to some extent shape. Andrew, do you?
Yeah, yeah. So the Animal Sentience Committee is this sort of government-appointed committee to basically scrutinise draft legislation that the government has. So to scrutinise bills. It's got 6 members, so they've been appointed. Essentially, they've sort of set up a system where they triage legislation. So there's so many pieces of legislation coming through, they have to figure out which ones do they actually report on. And so they've set that up. They have, as of last week, I think, published their first 2 reports. One was on the Animals Low Welfare Activities Abroad Now Act, because it passed last year, where they basically said this is pretty good. And the other one was on the Renters Reform Bill, and they raised various potential queries with how the Renters Reform Bill might affect animal welfare, particularly the welfare of pet animals. So you can read that if you're interested online. And classic DEFRA, they managed to publish the draft version before the amendments. So it wasn't actually the final version, but that has now been corrected. So yeah, the first 2 sort of reports from the Animal Sentience Committee have now been published, but we'll see over the next few years how effective this is.
We also need to see the minister's response, right? Because a key part of this is, if you've got this committee to oversee a duty ministers are under, what are ministers going to do when they receive one of these reports?
To Michael Gove.
That has to be, watched carefully. Oh yeah, I mean, it seems like the bare minimum is that the reports will be read. Yeah, I mean, there's a statutory duty to say something in Parliament in response to them, right? But what we really need to see is what is the nature of these responses, and are we going to see meaningful reshaping of policy where welfare risks are identified, or are we going to see the committee's advice being dismissed?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that the committee themselves is saying is that in the legislation, they basically report on stuff that's already been drafted. And what they're now actually doing is going to sort of civil servants and so on at earlier stages. And things like the Renters Reform Bill, the feedback supposedly from civil servants has been, we wish we'd heard this stuff earlier. So the committee are with something of a light touch because they're very concerned about judicial review, but they're going earlier on to talk to civil servants and ministers when the kind of legislation kind of has originated and the idea first arises, rather than their only role being at the end of the process, which I think is quite sensible.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because that was a grey area left open by the Act. And on the face of it, the duty is one of a responsive one. And then in practice, they're saying, well, given how civil servants work, it would be much better if we could be preemptive. And so that's another unknown, I think, how that will play out.
I can be quite quick. I was curious if you could speak a little bit about sentience and the necessity of having a brain. So it seems like, you're talking about a lot of kind of animals we consider as more like limit cases, like insects and cephalopods. Is any animal without a brain kind of, in your view, automatically outside of this kind of consideration, or how do you think about that? I know there's so much that is not explored at all. Do you think of those as, kind of a later stage of your project, or not even really in that scope?
Yeah, I think automatically would be too strong here. The situation is rather that, well, I think any indicator of sentience requires some kind of theoretical motivation for why it should be relevant. And our theories, for all the theoretical disagreement that exists, all the sort of serious and credible theories of the nature of sentience give a really crucial role to the brain, because we start from the human case, and in the human case, stuff that the peripheral nervous system is doing without the brain is not consciously felt. And that, to me, that's a very reasonable starting point, and it's entirely to be expected that the theories we develop end up giving a central role to the brain. That seems totally appropriate to me. And so when we find animals with none of those mechanisms, like sponges, for instance, or jellyfish, it's then, what you say is there's no evidence of sentience. You don't say you proved its absence, because we don't know how to prove its absence. But you say there's no positive evidence there. And yeah, so that is my view. Yeah, and I'm not saying that's it's not a sort of hard line that could never be revised, no matter what evidence came to light in the future. But it seems to me a fair description of the current state of the evidence as it is now.
Okay, so on that note, before we thank our speakers, just a few words of thanks. First to the Global Epistemologies project, aka Mario, who has co-sponsored this talk, and the second talk in the series will take place Thursday, 4th of April, 3 p.m. to 4:30. In the law school, so it's in the building next door. There we'll hear from Lars Chitka from Queen Mary and Joanna Gibson on Chitka's new book or recent book, The Mind of a Bee. And the question is similar to those that we investigated today, but with more focus on insects and bees in particular. And well, there are other talks in the series, but please you can find out more about this on the forum on the Decentring the Human website, and I guess also on the Global Epistemologies website. So I think now it's appropriate time to thank our speakers for a wonderful talk that really blew our minds. So thank you very much, Andrew and Jonathan.
Thanks, everyone.
Continue the conversation. There's now food is served by, well,
there's
on your right.
Yes, there's lunch afterwards. So please join us and continue the conversation. Thank you for our guest online, and thank you for participation. Bye.
Here on the, if you exit on the right and then in the foyer,